Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Winning Minds. A bit about Winning Minds, we are an inspirational storytelling platform powered by Women Inspiring Network. And the whole idea is to make it a paid forward movement so that we can bring to you the inspirational stories and the ideas from women content creators, authors, bloggers, vloggers, and see how we can harness some of the ideas that inspire them and motivate them and learn from them. So today we have a session called History and Mystery, and we have the really supremely talented Harini Nagendra here with us. Harini is a professor of ecology at Azim Premji University, and she is a really well-known writer on issues related to nature and sustainability. She's won multiple honors, multiple global honors for the scientific work that she has done on sustainability and ecology. And some of these are the Cozzarelli Prize from the US National Academy of the Sciences, the Eleanor Ostrom Senior Scholar Award, and most recently, the Clarivate Web of Science Award. She's written multiple nonfiction books earlier, and which have actually built on ecology and history. And she's also authored two books, co-authored two books with another author, Seema Mandoli. And today we are discussing a little bit about her latest book, which is called The Bangalore Detectives Club. It's a crime fiction novel. So welcome, Harini, really welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Amrita. This is really a pleasure to be here.
So, Harini, it's really fascinating as I was going through your bio, because, at one level, it says that you are looking at satellite imagery and looking at using the images to look at biodiversity and ecology and analysis, and combining that with community interviews and coming up with some understanding of how things are changing, right? And it's a topic which is close to everybody's heart today, in terms of sustainability and so. And you have a PhD, right? So that's sort of got you started in this direction of being a scientific researcher with all these 150 scientific publications that you have. So tell me a little bit about some of those early moments, growing up, science and creativity, what got you inspired into creativity, and why did you start writing? And yeah.
So it's a bit of a ramble, really. And I think, if I look back, I think for me, serendipity has always played a huge journey. I don't think, I think one needs to keep one's eyes and ears open for opportunities to come knocking on the door. And I remember this thing I read once when I was a kid, and I don't remember which story it was. And one of the characters said, it's a funny thing. I was looking for the truth. And one night, truth came knocking on my door. I opened it and I said, go away, I'm looking for the truth. And so if you're looking for something, I think in one place and you have your mind fixed that this is how my life is going to progress, I think sort of creativity doesn't, you let things take you where you are. So in terms of how I came to writing, I can't think actually of a time that I didn't write. I was an early reader. I have an older sister who's 11 years older than me. And so a lot of the time she was, I think, in charge of taking care of the baby sister. And so what she did very early on is just taught me how to read, because I was probably following her around everywhere and she wanted me to do something. So by 5.5, I was on, reading and lost in the world of books. And I loved that very much. And we were in Delhi then. So my father was a bureaucrat. Mm-hmm. I was in Delhi till I was 10. And there was then the Children's Book Trust, well, it still runs this Shankar's International Children's Competition. So I started writing little short stories. I won a medal when I was 8. I won another medal when I was 9. Zakir Hussain gave me the medal. It was very nice. All the little inspiring moments. Then Femina had this little competition on reimagining a fairy tale as a play. So I wrote something on that, and that got an honorable mention. So I loved writing. I used to write these little when I look at them, very childlike but very imaginative kinds of things. And my house was always so. I mean, my mom is also obviously a very good cook, but she's also a very good music player. So she started learning Carnatic music when she was 5, and she plays the veena. And so I grew up with her playing the veena, and I could tune it and play little songs before I formally learned. And I have formally learned. It's been, as my mother keeps telling me, I'm a lapsed player, and I should be actually paying more attention to it. But that was there. There was knitting and crochet and embroidery and all of these things going on at home. My sister used to do batik. My mother cooked. So I think any Indian home, normally we have all of these things going on that are rich and add to our sense of creativity. And at that time, I kind of lost touch with it. I'll have to say, actually, for instance, one of the things I found, I was in my school, I was in one of the Delhi public school branches, and this is a very long time ago, of course. I'm thinking of, in the 1970s, we had this class once a week, which was embroidery class. I can't remember what it was called, embroidery and gardening. I think that there was no space for gardening. So the girls would be asked to do embroidery, and the boys would be allowed to play. And because of that, I decided I don't like embroidery, knitting, and crochet, because that's what we would do. But now, much later in life, I got swine flu about 7-8 years ago, and I was quarantining myself. Now we're so used to quarantine, but then I was quarantining myself for 3 weeks in one bedroom. I thought I'll go mad with boredom, and I started crocheting, and my fingers went automatically. So then I started teaching my daughter crochet, and I realized, sometimes these ideas, which were obviously very important at those age, because you feel that unfairness of why are the boys allowed to play and we are not. But then you realize, in some sense, maybe it's an advantage that women are exposed to these creative opportunities much more. Yeah. So from there, I kept writing fiction off and on, poetry, all kinds of things, more or less for myself. During my PhD, I also wrote, so Deccan Herald, Hindu used to have these sections in the Sunday papers for kids. So I wrote kids' stories, published them. I used to write these little things they call middles in newspapers.
Okay.
But as I progressed and got more into my own research as a postdoc, when I got a proper job and started working, I didn't have the time for that. So my non-fiction writing took over, and it was academic papers, and then non-fiction books and newspaper editorials. But I guess that love for fiction was somewhere in the back of my mind. So somewhere in 2007, I started, the main character for the book, the idea had popped into my head. And I'd written short stories, but I had no idea how to write a full-length book. And that too, a book like a mystery book, which has to be plotted, right? The end has to match the beginning. Literary fiction, it can go anywhere. So how? So it took me a while to figure that out. Lots of false starts, changes in plots, etc. And then, 13, 14 years later, here's the book. So that's sort of the long journey.
That's really fascinating journey. And the fact that you kept that love for creativity alive, through the professional career is also really commendable. So you said that you started reading early. What do you like to read?
Everything and anything. So, but fiction, but largely I would say there were 3 things I used to read a lot of when I was younger: romance, mystery fiction, and fantasy. And as I'm growing older, I find I'm unable to read romance, because the kind of romance I like to read, whether it's the kind of mystery I like to read, is always soft. Nothing very hardcore. And unfortunately, the soft romance has these tropes that I'm increasingly uncomfortable. I can't read them anymore. Man comes and sweeps the woman across, Prince Charming on the horse rescuing. So I can't read that anymore. It bothers me. So romance is sort of, I think it's been 10, 15 years since I have dropped that almost entirely. But it's mysteries. And it's largely cozy and historical mysteries. Again, like I said, I don't read very grim things, and I can't deal with very grim. Not the topic, but the way of treatment there needs to be not
like the Scandinavian theme, which is very black and noir.
Serial killer, psychological. Why does a killer kill? This is true murders. None of that. Yeah, and fantasy.
Sure. And you must read a lot of non-fiction as well, right? Because that's
for my work. Yes. For my work. Yes.
Of course. So let's talk a little bit about history, because that seems to inhabit not just your current book, but also your previous books, right? And I was really fascinated actually to discover the books that you've written previously as well, because I work in tech. I run a tech company, but we work a lot with smart cities. So we're really looking at what should the future entail, and there is always that one element of it which is looking at the greens and sort of urban revitalization, and all of that becomes a part and parcel of how do you reimagine the cities. And when I see at the work that you have done, like, Cities and Canopies, which is looking at trees, trees being the memory keepers of our, of our civilization, and your book on Bangalore, which was Nature in the City, and again, you're tracing Bangalore's history and water bodies and from the 6th century to today. So there's a lot of history that you're working with, and in the new book, the nonfiction, again, it's colonial history, the British Raj, all of that is there. So what does history mean to you?
I think history are our roots. I don't think we can understand our future until we understand what grounds us in the present. And to understand what grounds us in the present, we need to go back to the past. So why do we do many things we do today? We do them unconsciously. We do them as, this is how we are, this is who we are. But often the roots are really in history. And sometimes that history is predictable. Things happen, X happened, so Y happened. Sometimes it's contingent. It just so happened that at a certain point of time, we took a path and that path has continued. And so I think history encourages us to be much more reflective about why we are here, what we're doing. And history in today's world is a very useful tool, but also much maligned tool, right? Everybody's twisting history or claiming to be twisting history or claiming that others are twisting history. So I think it's very important for each of us to understand our own histories and to understand the diversity of histories, because so I started with history. So when I started work on Bangalore, I finished my PhD in 97, and I started my research in 93, and so about 30 years now, and a lot of it was on forests.
Okay.
And so sometime in 2006-7, I started feeling dissatisfied that the work I was doing it was policy relevant, but I wasn't able to make an impact on any change, because you can only do that if you live where you work, right? And I live in a city, so I should start working in that city. And Bangalore was going through a lot of changes. So I started looking at that. And the plan was to start understanding, for instance, what has the metro or road widening or infrastructure done to trees, how many trees have been felled, or what are the condition of lakes, how have they changed over time. And I realized we don't know this over time business, because nobody still knows, by the way, how many trees there are in the city. Nobody knows how many lakes there used to be. So it started with a very simple thing, what was there 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. Then we stumbled across some old maps of the 1880s, and then we realized history is such a good hook, because if you start telling somebody a story about their past, everybody sits up and listens. And our biggest challenge, Amrita, has been that ecology, sustainability, everybody's in theory interested, but in our busy everyday lives, nobody actually has the time to pay attention. It's like, we'll see this later. Let's now develop. Let's now progress. We'll fix the ecology later. So how our challenge has always been, how do you reach, go beyond preaching to the choir, to the person on the street who's not, they don't like trees, but they don't understand why is it so important to stop everything they're doing and pay attention to that ecology, right? So their history becomes a very good hook. And so that's how we started that journey. But also history is just fascinating. Once you start looking into the archives, one thing leads you to another. We always say we go down rabbit holes, my colleagues and I. So we start looking at something that takes us to something, 3-4 days later, you emerge saying, okay, actually all I'm going to take for my research is just this one sentence, but I've gone into this fascinating excursion for 4 days and I suddenly realize I've lost this time. So
yeah, I think you need to cast it through vignettes and these stories, but then there is so much more beyond that story, right? That is there. And so obviously there are actors when you are looking at near-term history, right? When you're looking at the metro or the roads or the expansion and so on. But some of your work really has gone back into the into the BC era and things like that, and you're really looking at the footprint of history on nature, right? So tell us a little bit about what sort of research do you even have to do to understand what was it then, and then light on how it has changed.
Yeah, and this is a really good question. The challenge of doing any research in India as compared to, let's say, a Western country or other countries like Japan, which we are an oral history based thing, right? Everything is oral and documented and transferred. So when you've lost that oral history sometimes through breaks in the past, how do you actually document? And it's been very challenging for us. In fact, our first maps or first written documents often of cities like Bangalore are when the British came in. because they're the first persons who, but then that tells you through everything through a colonial gaze. How do you know what the Indians did and who were they and where did they live? So what we have is haven't done our own primary research as such, but there is a lot of stuff that was documented, again, largely by the British, but also by some Indian archaeologists and historians of various kinds. So, for instance, around Bangalore, there are these megalithic stone tombs. They're like menhirs, asterisks and the obelisks, those menhirs. So they're basically slabs of stones, and you'll see them in these fields in a circle. They're just kind of like sticking out at odd ends around in a circle. And often there'll be some brush grown around it, and the farmers putting their cattle through this. And what historians tell us is these are megalithic stone tombs around the time of the Iron Age. So they were about 2500 BC. But they're fascinating because we don't know who these people were and why they came to Bangalore. Bangalore is a semi-dry place. It doesn't have any perennial water. And one of the first things we learn in our history textbooks is people go where water is.
Yes.
Now there's no source of water. How are they managing? So we really don't know much. We also see that around the turn of between BC AD, there are people, they dig for the metro or they dig for something else, and they start discovering these urns, and these urns are filled with coins, which are Roman coins and coins from different parts of the world, which tell you that some trading was going on. Why would you have coins from so many parts of the world?
Sure. And why in a landlocked area?
Why in a landlocked area? No port, no roads, major roads that we know of, crisscrossing. Obviously, there was stuff happening in Bangalore that is completely lost to us. But from 500 AD, 600 AD onwards, we start getting inscriptions on stones, on copper plates. And so that is what I started mining. So there was this obsessive British administrator who went across the entire Karnataka and documented inscriptions that he found. Lewis Rice was his name. And then after that, there are many more inscriptions that the Archaeological Survey of India has been transcribing. And now there is it's actually a very nice amateur history group called Inscription Stones of Bengaluru, which is a Facebook group. They go and document all of these and they find them and preserve them. So, there are all of these places we can mine to understand local history. And that's really where the past has gone in.
That's really it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating. So the other question becomes how do you determine what story is important? And as you said, there are people recast history, right? So some of it we are aware of it today, and we also know how in the Raj era history was recast in certain ways and Absolutely. So on, right? But when you are looking at cities or trees or nature, and you're looking at these large spans of time, how do you pick out? Some of it comes from what material you get, but some of it how do you determine which stories to tell and how to tell them?
Yeah, this is always a challenge, because I think if you're determining stories, you are in some sense cherry picking, right? Which is the narrative you choose to select? That's the narrative that gets held. So the way I've been trying to do it is to pick a diversity of reflections. So for instance, if we have, let's say, a British bureaucrat talking about a lake, can we also have the story, because there's one letter in the archives, which is actually from local horticulturalists who have a different perspective of the lake.
Sure.
So there might be 500 records from the British administrators, but one letter from that Kannada local, set of growers.
Mm-hmm.
And so we will highlight that letter because that's the balanced perspective. Or there might be one record, one oral history discussion we did with a weaver whose ancestors lived near the lake and were pushed out of the lake because the British took over, and then it became Karnataka's, Sampangir Lake became the Kantirva Stadium in Bangalore. So we highlight those stories. So diversity is something we're trying to see, how different people talk about the same events, exchange in very different ways. So that's one thing we do. The other thing I find very interesting, which I read somewhere again, is that when you start looking at history, you try, or any trends over time, you try and look at data. But when you communicate it to people, you pick a story that represents that data. So in that sense, you're obviously representing the trend, but what people see is not data. What people relate to are human stories. So you pick the right story, but pick it with, I guess, some integrity that there'll always be a story that you can pick to tell your point of view. How do you know that you're trying to pick the right stories? You give that diversity to people.
No, and that's a very interesting way of doing it, to bring in counterpoints. and then let the reader infer to some extent, right? Like, what they want to infer out of that narrative as well. So, shifting gears to the Bangalore Detectives Club and in the history context again, because that's near history, that's known history. There's a lot, available for, from the colonial, the Raj era. So how did you pick and choose? Did you do research? Did you watch movies? What was the research process for that?
So I was already immersed in so much research, right? So we had a lot of material. So we had these there are administrative reports, there are annual reports, there are gazettes, that are occasional collations, there are ledger files of all kinds of disputes about a lake, a tree, a road, all kinds of things. But so that's what I use for my historical documents and maps. For the book, in addition, I wanted interesting stories. And sometimes these are very boring and dry and factual, right? So then sometimes you'd find a ledger file where people are arguing bitterly about something. So we take that. Or sometimes, like, there are these Lal Bagh archives which tell you about the zoo. So I found this fascinating anecdote that I put in my book, which is there was a tigress that had given birth to tiger cubs and she refused to suckle them. So they got a street dog and she had pups, and then they gave her the tiger cubs. Now, what we don't know is, I always wonder what happened to her pups. Did someone just throw them away and replace them with tiger cubs? Because you can't put them together. So that part we don't know. Sure. But there was actually this street dog suckling tiger cubs, and that was how they reared. So I thought that was too fascinating not to put in. Or newspaper accounts, you find these really fascinating newspaper accounts. Or there's this little book. Actually, I should have the book, so let me show you. I want to show you because I just think many women might have books like this. So this is this little book I read recently and I got. It's called Ambi, and it's the fascinating story of a woman who was, I think, very young, maybe 20, 21, when her husband passed away, and she had 2 children and was pregnant with a third. And we're talking about 1913 or something like that. And then her father pushed her to get educated. So she studied further and she eventually retired as a principal of a school. Okay. So Amba Bai, I think. And so her granddaughter has put this together with family reminiscences. And I think her uncle, so this woman's son was alive then in his 90s. So he talked a great deal about the life. And so things like this are incredible resources, Or there's another book I have in Kannada, which is this elderly man who was the Geological Survey of India director. He wrote this book about his father's life. And so that talks about this very interesting time during the plague in the 1890s, when this man had come to write a school exam, but he needed money and he couldn't find anyone who could give him money because all his neighbors, etc., was evacuated in plague camps. So he describes in this very harrowing detail about how he was moving through the city for 2 days. Some kind person gave him 2 annas, I think, and he bought a bunch of bananas, but otherwise he didn't have anything to eat, nothing to drink. And he was trying to collect money. So you get these bits and pieces of stories of the Indian voice, authentic voices. And that's really what I did. And no movies, but I looked at a lot of photographs, trying to recollect. So I would use the photograph to kind of see 4 or 5 photographs and then close my eyes and try and imagine exactly. And fortunately for me, I think 1970s, 80s Bangalore, at least till like 83, 84, was very similar to what it was in the 1920s. It's only since then that, post liberalization, economic growth, or, the IT, all of this stuff happened and Bangalore has changed. So some of these things I can actually pull out from memory, childhood memory.
No, that's like fantastic. And it's like, this whole personal history sort of meshing with the national history, it's at least definitely for people of a certain age, who went through massive turmoil, pre-independence, a lot of things were happening. So it's definitely rich pickings. So let's talk a little bit about what was the process of writing, because you've written the scientific journals, which are absolutely cut and dried. You need to prove your point, to your nonfiction books, right? And so in the nonfiction book, the first thing that I would love to know is, how did you decide on the topic? Why trees, for example? Where did that idea come from? And then how do you when you structure a nonfiction book, right? You need to have certain themes in mind that you want to explore. So how did you arrive at those themes from whatever latent knowledge that you had from all of the years of research that you had already been doing?
Right. So how did so let's start with the first book. So I was doing research on Bangalore from 2006 onwards, and I always thought that I would at one point put it together into a book. And so sometime in about 2013 or 14, I started saying, if I put this together in the book, what do I want to put? And so I decided to write this book, which is Nature in the City, Bengaluru in the Past, Present, Future, which is this ecological history that we were talking about, the deep history all the way to the present and looking a little bit forward into the future. And so that was relatively easy for me to structure. I knew I wanted an academic book, but a semi-popular academic book. So the idea was that people who are used to reading serious books of nonfiction, does not have to be an academic. They can pick it up and read it. And so I found, for instance, now a lot of architecture college students read it, landscape planners read it. So journalists read it. So I didn't expect that it would go into all these places. Students of art and design use it for their classes and activities, So that has been very satisfying. But that I also found that there were many people who said, look, this is a very interesting book, but it's a bit heavy for me. And so I started thinking of what does that mean heavy for me? So my sister said that, for instance, my mother's the reason I love trees, because she did a BSc in botany in the 1950s. And, she fought to go to college and hostel in those days, which is quite radical. And then could never take up botany as a profession, but used to take us for walks, showed me how to cut open flowers and things like that. And I always found this very fascinating. But even she said, and she's a big reader of nonfiction. She doesn't read fiction. She said, it's a bit heavy. I'm going slow with this. So I said, okay, what, again, this whole thing of preaching outside the choir, how do you get more people to look at this? And then Seema Mundoli, my colleague, and I, we'd been writing a lot of academic papers like from then. And she loves trees, but is a very much more experiential with trees than even I have been. She grew up in a college campus in Vizag, Walter University. Her parents were both university faculty. And she and her brother grew up climbing trees and playing on them, making games. So we started thinking, okay, if we talk to people about trees, this is what people do. They climb trees, they play with the flowers, they play with the seeds, they make jewelry, they swing from the branches, they shoot each other with imaginary guns, with sticks and all of these things. So we said, okay, let's just do all of this. We'll write a book on trees. And our plan was to do a fun version of Nature in the City for Bangalore. Okay. But then we said, okay, one book for Bangalore, one book for Bombay, one book for Delhi. Doesn't make any sense. Let's just do Indian cities. And then we thought a lot about structure. So we went back and forth. But one of the things we were trying to figure out, do we do species or do we do themes? So then suddenly at some point inspiration struck and we said, let's do vignettes. So short chapters, 2-3 pages. For the person who says, I find this heavy, you just dip into a chapter at random. For the person who likes to read, you read from beginning to end. So both people have something to do. And these 3-4 page chapters will alternate. So we'll pick a species that everybody knows, banyan, people, eucalyptus, rain tree, something that you see across places. And we'll pick themes that people talk about, native species. Why native? Is it even important? Or how do children relate to trees? Or how do we use trees in medicine and food? And my grandmother used to make a hair oil out of, banyan tree roots. So how do we do all of these things? So that's the structure we worked with, and people told us that for them it worked, because we found a number of, in fact, people who were reading it to 10-year-old kids and 10-year-old kids who were reading it on their own. And we hadn't thought of kids as audiences, but we were very thrilled that they were actually audiences for us. So that's how it went.
So on your website, there is that picture, the illustrative. I guess it's a poem, right, about trees.
Which one?
On your website?
A poem about trees.
No? There's this illustration, about trees. So I was just wondering, is that something as well, illustrative books that you have done?
Yes. So I'm trying to figure out which one are you talking about. Is it the So Many Leaves or Cities and Canopies?
Yes. No, So Many Leaves.
So Many Leaves. Yes. So that is the next book. So Seema and I were then thinking about doing something for children. So that's with Pratham. Pratham Books is a non-profit trust, as you might know, and they do these multilingual books. So we wanted something that reaches kids as far as and wide as we could. So we started with this very simple thing, what do you see around you? And you might see leaves or you might see flowers. So we said So Many Leaves. And Barkha Lohia is the person who illustrated that. So it's just a little book on for little kids on how many leaves there are. Some are large, some are small, some are shiny, some are smooth, some are spiky, hairy, so that they go and touch the leaves, play with them, pull them apart. That kind of a thing. Yeah.
It's it was entirely too cute, when I saw that. So let's talk a little bit about fiction now, and you said that the characters actually emerged in your mind much before the book was written. So, so clearly, then the character came first, and tell us then, what about the character came and how did it come? And then how did you then arrive at the plot?
So Kaveri, my main protagonist, landed in my head sometime in 2007. I was in my mother's house. I still remember looking at some other documents, and I just thought it would be so fascinating to write about. Which she just sort of almost came and said, "Write about me." And I didn't know, if she was married. In fact, when she turned up, I knew that there would be a spouse, a very supportive spouse. But at that time, I thought, it would be that she had maybe someone who was teaching her tuitions. So I had a different plan for her, that she would be in her uncle's house and he hired somebody to teach her, and then they fell in love and they got married. So the first book would be that. But then I realized that I had to have a character who could solve mysteries, which means she had to be the youngest I could place her was 19, because she had to be mature enough to get into a mystery. And then 19 is very old for a 1920s woman not to be married already. So that was impossible. And then so that's the kind of thinking process. And then I said, okay, she can't have been, okay, so she has to be married. But I did want to show the book, because for me, somehow when she landed in as a character, there was a lot of this exploratory thing of discovering herself. First time in a new marriage, discovering herself, her identity as a human being, as a woman, as, where's my place in society. And I couldn't do that if she was already married with a bunch of kids, and in 19, actually, you would have been in 1920s, probably having 3 kids and running your own house for a while.
For all you know, yeah.
So I'm thinking, my grandmothers, for instance, obviously, so my father's mother got married at 13, but my father's older sister also got married at 13. Which was not unusual for those times. She was born in 1924, so it was. So then, okay, the way I worked around that was, I said Kaveri's got married when she was 16, but as was common in those days, they didn't send her to her husband's house immediately. So she was married in name, and then 3 years later, she finished her matriculation, and then they sent her to her husband's house. So I worked around that. So that's how the marriage came in, and I always knew the husband would be supportive, because I was really inspired by the fact that women of those times, not all, but many of them managed to make their way, somehow or the other. So my husband's aunt, who is 96 now, went swimming in a sari in the Madras club, and she used to go horse riding. She played tennis in her sari. So, and you hear, there are a lot of women that you hear these stories about, right? Sure. And my mother's grandmother, who was born in the previous, in the 20th century, she was so she was like a local Vaid. Her father was a herbal doctor, Ayurvedic practitioner. She learned from him. Her husband was a British employee. He was the superintendent of Ooty jail, so he had a fairly respectable position, and he wanted her to do certain things that kept his status alive. But she was also a midwife, and so people would come. She used to tell my mother, apparently, that people would knock on her door in the middle of the night. There would be a strange guy with a cart. She would go off with him to God knows where, deliver the child, dig a pit in the garden, bury the afterbirth, come back, have a ritual bath, purify herself, start cooking. So they did what they wanted to, while also doing what society demanded of them. Sure. But you needed one supportive person. So for me, that supportive person would be her husband. It was sort of natural. And those were the 2 characters I had. The rest of it I had to just figure out. Lots of false starts, backtracking, going halfway through, changing the plot, lot of changes along the way.
So, as I was reading through, it kind of reminded me of the series of books that I love. I mean, obviously, I've been compared to Alexander Bacall Smith, but there is an Australian writer, and she's got this series of books called the Phryne Fisher series.
Yes, I love those.
Set in 1920s Melbourne, and again, really fascinating, light but very engaging, and it's become a Netflix series. So. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So we've watched a few of those, my husband and I. We loved them, but the Netflix India stopped showing them for some reason. So I'm so devastated. Really? Yeah. But yeah, I love Fryne Fisher. I absolutely love her.
So your books also have a lot of recipes. This book has a lot of recipes, right? So where did these recipes come from? Are they your grandmother's recipes? Are they your recipes?
All over the place. So I knew again it would have cooking as a core theme, because so that was also part of the charm for me, because I love traditional recipes, and I'm very obsessive about writing down what my mother used, or what she tells me her mother used, and those kinds of things. And so that's something I knew I wanted. And I love these things that they call culinary cozies, which are usually American and often about desserts. So the heroine will have a dessert shop or a cupcake shop or some kind of a baking outfit, right? So I love those. So I said, okay, I'm going to do this, but with an Indian twist. And then the recipes I had to pick and choose. So the book is also, as you know, it's being simultaneously bought and published in the US, in the UK, and in India. So I needed recipes that would not be too simple for an Indian audience, but also would not be too complex for a US audience. So frankly, if I'd selected them completely for the Indian audience, I would have done a very different set of much more complex recipes. Here I did a mix. So bisibele bath is the one which is a very famous Kannada delicacy, and what you get in the shops is often not what you make at home. And my mother's bisibele is very famous, so I had that. But Priya Doraswamy, whom you know again, is my agent, and in the US is another Bangalore friend, a friend from school days. And she said, no, I make a wonderful Instapot recipe, Instapot version of bisibele. So we went back and forth on that, So that was that. And then I thought, okay, so I thought of putting together what would be a complete meal that someone could serve. Sure. So a drink, which is, and I said lassi, everybody knows abroad, but nobody knows the majjige or the salt version, which is what we have in Karnataka. So we said we'll do that. And then Ismail is a policeman. So I said I must have something that is not just Kaveri's kind of culture, but other, Bangalore had different cultures. Sure. So I said, okay, let's have Ismail make the dry fruit laddus. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so his wife packs him this power snacks because he's all police spirit always out. So his dry fruit laddus, I put in the dry fruit laddus, and that was a sweet dish, So that's the journey that I did.
No, it's fantastic. So I'd done a book with another one of Priya's authors, Bharti Kirchner, and that was a book set in sort of Raj era Bengal. And she had put in a lot of old recipes from sort of lost recipes of Bengal in that book. So again, it becomes very interesting, right? You're reading, and then suddenly there is this character who loves cooking, and the recipes come in. So you said that the characters came and then you went back and forth on the plot, and obviously writing a mystery plot, it's planting a lot of clues and then unraveling them. So you need to have a very strong structure and a plot. So how did you arrive at that, and what's your process of actually working through it?
Okay, so this is something I really had to go a lot to understand what works for me. And I read a lot. So this book, I sort of muddled through, really. I mean, I'd say I went to the plot, I went back, I did it, I went to in a completely different direction. The original was set in 1890s. I had two different original kinds of plots that I completely changed. And then I did a third, moved it to the 1920s because it's a more rich era to work with. Priya and I went back and forth about that. And so we decided to switch it. And I'm glad I switched it. And then that was book one. And along the way, then I started reading a number of books and thought, maybe I'll take some short courses. So I'm a member of the Sisters in Crime and Mystery Writers of America, which are two professional organizations in the US, which have these very small and easy online courses by writers for writers. And I read a number of books, and they all tell you that there's a 3-act or a 5-act structure. You start with the base, you explain the backstory, then you go into this, and then there's a climax, and then there's a denouement. Doesn't make sense to me at all in the sense of how my brain works. Sure. I can logically make sense, but I can't structure it that way. It's almost like I need to plunge in. There are characters and there's a setting, and they do something, and that leads to something, and then something else happens, and then that leads to something else. So it's almost like you can take an analogy of you drive down a road and you see a crossroad, and when you get to the crossroad, you can decide which direction to take. So until you do that, I can't even figure out how to get to the end. So when I did the second book in the series, which I just did, that's how I did it. The editors wanted an outline. And so I plunged into the outline the way I plunged into my first book. I just sat and wrote for about 5-6 days, except I didn't write the full book. Sure. I wrote like a 20-pager saying, and the first scene I described very elaborately because I had to sink myself in the scene. So chapter 1 was like 3-4 pages. And then towards the end, it was like, oh, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. But I had to get to the point for things to happen. Sure. And then what reassured me is, again, the Sisters in Crime and Mystery Writers of America have these very nice podcasts by very established writers for writers. And I was so relieved to know that many of the writers, I really adore their work, say this doesn't work for them. They just plunge in. And somewhere halfway through the book, and they're on book 30 and 35, they're always panicking, thinking, my God, I have no idea who the murderer is. Sometimes 20 pages from the end, they don't know. And then it makes sense to them. And then they go back and plant the clues and the red herrings, right? So I think that's just probably the way it works for me. And I was very glad to know I'm not completely crazy and this is the way it works for others. I mean, A, doesn't work, and B, once I tried that. So I have another book set in contemporary Bangalore that I'm trying to see how to rework.
Okay.
But again, I started with a very clear plot and then I couldn't continue. So I had to plunge in because it bored me to death, frankly, to know what's going to happen and then write about it. What's the fun? I have to discover it for myself as I go along.
No, and that's part of the joy of writing, right? Like, the characters surprise you. They go on to all these tangents and something that you didn't imagine happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, two of the characters in my Bangalore Detectives Club, Ismail, who's the policeman, and Mala, who's another important character, they were not part of the book. They just walked into a scene, and then I said, "Oh, they're here." And in fact, there was a very boring young policeman who was supposed to be a comic figure, and he was just very boring. He wasn't comic. So Ismail walked in and sort of threw him out, and actually threw him out in one chapter and said, "I'm taking over. Go. You're really slow. You can't do this." And he stayed, and he became a character. And Mala again came in for a scene, and I had no idea who she was, and she's become a major character. So I like it. It's satisfying.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So tell me a little bit about actually crafting the character of the characters, right? I mean, their tone, their voice, how will they speak? And especially when you're looking at 1920s, I mean, how did you actually decide how each one of these characters would behave? And yes, you had a spunky heroine in mind, so she had to do things a particular way, but the supportive spouse that you have, how did you craft this character? So
again, I don't know how to tell you, in terms of, I think they just told me. So it must, and when I say they told me, obviously something in the subconscious was going on. I like watching people. So I've always loved, when I was a kid, I remember I used to go by train or car or bus and watch all these, you'd pass by these dark homes. You'll see a man and a woman talking, or a child and a parent. And I start dreaming about their lives and saying, okay, who is this child? Where did he go to school? What is he telling his mother? What is she cooking for him? All of these stories. So I've always listened to stories, tried to understand people, ask them about their lives. Very, that way, I really like. I'm very fascinated by how different people are. So maybe a lot of that came in, and there were things like, so I wanted, for instance, Kaveri to cook, and she's a new wife in 1920s, and she's always studied and didn't know much about cooking. Maybe that was inspired by my mother, because my mother was very keen on studies, and then when she got married and had to transform herself into a bureaucrat's wife, and people would keep popping in, she's a very good cook, but she wanted to cook to please her husband. But she's also, in her own way, a very quietly staunch, but feminist. As many women over of those times, it's, you wanted to please your family whom you loved, but you also wanted to do what you wanted to do. So I said, now how do I do this? And my father is actually the one who taught me how to cook. My mother was visiting my sister when she had a baby, and my father was at work, and I had to cook, and I had no idea how to cook. So he taught me how to cook, and he was a very good cook. But he didn't do the daily cooking. So I thought, okay, now what if I reimagine this and have, so one of the things I guess men of those generations, even if they cooked, often didn't do was cleaning.
Sure.
Right. So I remember as a kid asking my father, why is it that you won't sponge the table or wash the dishes? Why is it, but the cooking you will do. And he was very supportive of my mother in many ways. She later in life wanted to play the veena and go back to, she did her exams when she was in her 60s. Junior and senior. So he would keep lunch ready for her when she came home from, so he was very supportive. But there were some things he wouldn't do, right? And my father-in-law, on the other hand, was extraordinarily also very supportive, but he would wash my mother-in-law's clothes. No problem. So it's all these little things that you put together, I guess. I said, okay, so what would surprise Kaveri? Maybe her husband making the morning coffee for her.
Yeah.
So and those times, and I mean, I'm very fortunate that I'm a very grumpy person in the morning, and my husband is an early riser. So from the beginning, we've been married 26 years. He makes my morning coffee, tea. So I always laugh and say, I know I wrote it into our marriage contract. You would do this for me, whatever else you do. He has to make my morning tea. Yeah. So maybe it's all of these bits and pieces that came in. If I think rationally, but at that time it was just natural that there was be Ramu making a coffee and washing the dishes.
Good. I have that in my marriage contract as well. You tell me a bit about your writing schedule. Do you actually have a schedule, and do you have a non-fiction writing schedule and a fiction writing schedule? How does it all work?
I work very well to deadlines. I
Yeah.
need a deadline and then I get done. And I'm lucky so far, touch wood, because I've had to write so much and so consistently for 30 plus years that I don't, this writer's block or sitting there, it doesn't show up. What I do is I show up, I have a fixed time for writing, and the first 20-30 minutes, I know I will waste time somehow.
Sure.
So that wasting time has to be a particular kind. If I land up reading newspaper articles and blogs, then it goes away. So I do something that is partly brain work, but very light, like Wordle, Sudoku of the easy level. So brain is working, but enough is cleared up that, it can also think. And then I plunge in. So I write in an intensive block. So for instance, I finished now book 2 of the Kaveri series, and I'm waiting for the final line edits to come back. But I also have a non-fiction book due to Penguin, which is overdue. So I have to sit and start working on that. So there'll be these intensive 3-4 months where I'm working on a book.
Sure.
Then I set up a schedule for that.
Sure.
And typically what I try and do is, so for instance, with the fiction book, I said that, okay, I need to finish this. So I need to write 5 days a week for at least 2 hours. Okay. So 2 days was Saturday, Sunday, which became more like 4-5 hours. Morning, I would, so let's say 10 to 1 or 9 to 1, I'd set aside for that. But the other 3 days, I would actually get up in the morning and finish that before I start my work day, because writing fiction is like you were saying, non-fiction has to be very to the point. I write my newspaper editorial 600 words. Do 610, the editor will cut, and you don't know which words the editor is going to cut. So you better, you cut and make your piece the way you want it. Again, with non-fiction language, you don't waffle on for 3 pages. But then if you're not, you can't waffle on in fiction also. But if you're not elaborating a bit, there's no joy.
Sure. You have to be a little bit more descriptive, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. So if I write non-fiction, I can't write fiction after that, the whole day, even if I give myself a gap. So I do it first thing in the day. And it's also good because my work day is very intense. By the time, I'm doing research administration, I'm doing teaching, I'm doing designing courses, I'm meeting students, I'm, all of the things I'm writing. So there's no space for breathing. So once I plunge into my work day, it's just impossible to get to plunge back into 1920s Bangalore. I'm sure. Constantly something is urgent on the email. I step away from the mail for 20 minutes and I have 50 emails. So it's first thing in the morning, I get it done.
So you're able to literally immerse into it in half an hour and sort of have.
Then I have my 1.5 hours, and I'm fortunate that in that 1.5 hours, usually I get 2,000 to 2,500 words done. Okay. So it's a fairly quick process when I'm in that intensive phase. But that also means that I need a break when I'm done, because it's really intense. I've written a lot then, so the book 2, book 1 took me 13 years. Book 2, I did the first draft in 7 weeks.
Okay. Wow.
I was also working on a deadline, but I did,
And so a bit more personal, how do you actually balance so many different things that you're doing? Where do you how do you carve out your time? How do you carve out your sort of mental framework for managing family and work and students and work writing and
so it's never easy. Writing. I have a 14-year-old, I have an 85-year-old mom who lives with us. I have an extraordinary supportive family. So my husband it's taken over a lot of, often what happens with women is, I think that even if they do have some house help with cooking and cleaning, they're doing the brain work of running the family, right? And ordering groceries and things. So when I'm writing, my husband takes over everything. And I'm just, so very fortunate. He takes over all of the stuff. And my daughter's 14. She's very supportive now. So both of them help me brainstorm plots and things like that. And in that sense, my mother-in-law also, actually, my mother did BSc botany and went into a hostel and couldn't work, and loved the fact that she had a scientist as a daughter-in-law. So she's no more now with us, but she lived with us till she passed away. And she loved reading so very supportive. I've just been very fortunate, let's say, all the time, my father-in-law, mother-in-law. So that part is fine, but I still want to spend time with them. And we are again very fortunate. I have this lovely housekeeper, Lakshmi, who's part family. She's been with us from 2002. So she again does the cooking, the running of the house, the helping my mother with stuff, and so that's great. But it's still, there's, obviously my daughter's a teen, she wants to spend time with me, so I have to make sure that I keep that time. My mother needs to spend time with me. There are times when there's elder care involved, going to hospitals or doctor visits. So all of that has to be scheduled. So careful scheduling. I just schedule everything in. Where sometimes I don't get time, which I'm trying now when I just turned 50, is my own exercise time.
Sure, sure.
And that is something I'm sort of realizing in the past 2-3 years. I've got plunged into so many things, adding this fiction writing as a component, and my exercise time is almost gone. And I'm paying for that in terms of health issues. So I think as women age, we just have to make sure that we take this time out for ourselves in terms of health. My daughter did this very interesting thing for me 2 weeks ago, because she said, I used to give her these little things. If you don't do this, write lines, because that's the best punishment. I will not XYZ. So she's now told me, if I don't do my 10,000 steps on my tracker, for every 1,000 steps, I have to write 20 lines. And she's very perceptively, she said, because Amma, I know why you don't walk, because that's going to take away time from your precious writing. So if I give you lines to do, again, that's going to take away time. So you'd rather walk than do the lines. I said, oh my God, she knows me very well.
So your careful planning, is it like, are you actually like, you create your task lists and things like that? Are you a planner?
I have a to-do list. I have a very non-techie to-do list. It's in Word.
Okay.
I have a very detailed Word document. Someone was recently telling me, why don't you do this, but I like it because I can see everything, and it's really extraordinarily detailed. It will have things like, do this at this time, 9 you do this, 9:30 you do this, 10 you do this, and it will have everything there. And as soon as I'm done, I delete it from my to-do list. So I love that. The greatest satisfaction when I've deleted it and that shrinks. So that's what I do. So my word list, my to-do list is my savior.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So and tell me a bit about marketing the book, and how was it different when you were out with your nonfiction book? How is it different this time, and how are you reaching out to audiences in the US and the UK?
So it's been, I'm very glad that I did the first 2 nonfiction books, because I now understand the whole process involved in marketing. So my first nonfiction book, I think like every author, I was very naive. I thought, you write it, you publish it, and then the publisher takes care of everything else. And of course they do, but they're not going to, they have 1,000 books. It's your one book that you need to be doing the marketing. So then I plunged in. And that's actually when I started with Twitter and using my Facebook account more, and LinkedIn. And, by the time of Cities and Canopies, I even had Instagram because it was very photo friendly. So I'm trying to do all of this. And then there are some things I haven't. Just someone said Pinterest, and someone said use Instagram with these the videos. And I said, there's a limit to where my comfort levels lie. But so that marketing, the fact that you need to be doing things, is something that I'm comfortable with.
Sure.
But what I didn't realize is the fiction part of it. I get many more requests for interviews, podcasts, those kinds of things. With the nonfiction, it was more finding people who would review the book.
Sure.
And this whole, people want to know, I guess, now how do you craft a book? These kinds of very interesting things, or very, 20 questions that I get in terms of how do you write this. So lovely. I've been enjoying it a lot, but it's been extremely intense. And the time zone difference is huge. So US, Europe, UK, I'm doing these things at 11:30, 12:30, 1 at night, and then staying up and doing these interviews. And I actually prefer that, because people ask, so they always give you a choice, and they say, would you rather do early morning? But I'm not a morning person, so I'll be grumpy and scowling at 5:30, and I can't ask my husband to get up at 5 and make me a cup of tea for 5:30. So I'm like, okay, I'll stay in the night. I'd rather stay awake at night. So that gets intense. It gets intense, but I have to say it's been much more fun than the nonfiction marketing, because like I said, the nonfiction is essentially give someone the book and they write the review, whereas here you're participating in this very interactive process. And Instagram has been maybe, I don't know what it is about book fiction, but I didn't realize Instagram is such a big thing. I mean, I've heard of Bookstagram, but so much pops up on Instagram in terms of bloggers and talking about the book. And it's fun. This young woman recently put up something with the book, and she's wearing a period dress.
Okay.
Ruffles, and she's got a magnifying glass, and she's holding the book up to cover her face, so only her eyes are showing. And I just loved it. For me, it was, if Kaveri was wearing a gown, that's what she would do. These ruffles, and maybe not the high slit that she had, but I think Kaveri would have loved to do the high slit if she could get away with it. And that magnifying glass, I thought that was just fit the book. And you can't do that with nonfiction.
No, and it's so much fun when you have fans who are doing this for you.
Right, exactly.
Fantastic. So if we're sort of coming to the close of the hour, So I just wanted to ask you, your advice to young women out there. And, you've beautifully juggled both your professional career and your personal passion for writing. So what would you advise them? I mean, it's something that people often either say that they have to choose, or they want to balance. So what would your advice be to them, to people who want to write?
I think to persist. Find your space, somehow persist. Like it did take me a very long time to get to book one, but I found book one to book two is a huge, learning curve. And now with the second book, I know how to do this so much. So I just say persist. It's life is long term. It's a long term view that you take. If you can't do it now, you do it next year. If you can't do it next year, do it the year after that. I remember when my daughter was very small, there were many things I wanted to do professionally that I put on hold. And I remember my sister telling me, because again, she's so much older and her son was older. She said, look, I can completely relate. I went through the exact same time, or let's say when, parents-in-laws are unwell and we've nursed and lost 3 parents. My mother is there. It's very special to us now. But, having gone through all these caregiving episodes, there are times when life takes over and it must, right? I mean, if you have a sick parent or a child who needs you, you're not going to at that time say, okay, I need me time. I need to work on my book. It's not going to happen. But life is the long game. So I'd say work around that. And then when you get your time, push it, but don't forget it. Often what happens is then we forget that, and I'd say make your families partners as much as you can. Because my family now, I started thinking of writing the book when I was pregnant with my daughter. But now it's something which is a family pursuit. They read my book, they give me plot points, we discuss it. So it's our time together is spent. For instance, if I read a lot of mystery fiction book, how to write books, and I listen to a lot of these mystery podcasts. But my daughter, since I started writing at an early age, I got her interested in writing at an early age. So she also writes. So when I'm listening to a podcast, I often listen alongside her and we discuss plot points. So she's a partner in what I'm doing, right? It's not that I'm doing something and excluding her from it, but we're doing it together. So I'd say just find that space where you can bring your family along in these activities to whatever extent you can. And remember that it's the long haul. So when you keep the time for your family, I guess this is do it without resentment, because that's the beauty and the joy of having the family, right? Because when you that's also the time that you need to spend with them. And there are times when they need you and you need them. And without that support, I think there's no point. No success or fame will ever replace the support of your family or the time that your family has with you. So keep that as your center. Once you keep that as a center and core, I think other things emerge.
Fabulous. So, you've had such an inspirational and achievement-filled life in multiple areas, right? So, what would you tell to young women across the board? How should they, what should they think of, when they are looking at their lives?
I think believe that everything is possible. My father used to always tell me, never aim for the trees, aim for the sky. So always believe that you can do the sky, then you'll at least get the trees. If you keep your aim as the trees, that this is possible for me, let me look at what is possible, then you're not going to get. So aim big and hang in there I think. Aim big in a way that you bring people along with you, because I think I strongly believe that's the power that women have. The power of a sisterhood or a community or a collective. I think we work in such ways that we always bring people along with us. And that is not to say, of course, to bend over backwards to please people who ask impossible things of you. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that if we work towards something in the long haul, aiming big, but taking the steps that it takes to get there, then I think we'll get there. So I think that's what I would tell them. Be yourselves and aim big.
Absolutely. It's all about perseverance and sort of taking the hard knocks and continuing, right? So,
exactly.
Yeah. Fantastic, Harini. It's been a lovely hour talking to you, and I wish you all the best for your book. And
thanks,
catch up again sometime.
Yes, I love that.
Thank you so much.